the definition of both those terms. It's a good start.
That is a good start.
From the dictionary.
So like, it's strange to me that this is still a discussion having, because it's like, even on a pragmatic scale, I mean, what are they using as the basis for their understanding of why socialism is good? It's all theoretical. There is nothing that has been put into practice. They've shown that socialism in a compound doesn't work. It doesn't work. But anyway, we'll get into the definitions of it and why they think what they think is a problem, because a lot of people don't really ask the right question when it comes to this question. Because biblically, does God promote capitalism and socialism? Well, that's probably not the right question. That's probably more ethics than it is principle. But I want you to start thinking on these terms so you can start seeing how asking worldview questions, you have to sometimes dig. Asking questions like abortion, asking questions about killing, about stealing, those are easy stuff. You know, like basically, I try to get people focused a lot of times on not the what, but the why, the reason behind certain programs. I'm gonna turn that blind off because I'm basically shaded here. Well, man, I'm all shadowed. Okay. We had it open because we lost power on Sunday.
Yeah.
And they had all the kids down here. And the kids were like going, we can't see. So they opened up all the windows so they could see. You know, on Sunday morning, did you hear the numbers? I'm sure you heard the commotion at 10 o'clock, right? At 10 o'clock, all the commotion of the kids going up and downstairs. We had 12 kids under the age of 8.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
That's great.
So like that's pretty amazing. You think about it.
Yeah, in the dark.
They turned the tables on the sides and made a room in here. And when everyone's here, we have 16, 17 under the age of 13. That's
Compared to what we had when you.
which was 0. All right, so obviously when you're dealing with questions like this, you do want to start thinking by definitions. Okay, so capitalism and socialism is under a broader scale. What's bigger from that? What's bigger than just saying socialism or capitalism? What's the bigger scale? Economics, right? By the way, I love this one slide. It says capitalism is equally shared, an equally shared like blessing, and socialism is equally shared misery. And I found this one here interesting too, because it had like North Korea and China, Venezuela as socialist leaning. Like, I'm not sure if you guys know what socialist leaning is. And pure competition and pure communism, they say does not exist, but there are a couple of countries which I would put North Korea under pure communism. It is pure communism. There's no free market in North Korea. So I started with economics. Did you? Okay, what'd you find?
The science that deals with the production, distribution, and consumption of wealth, and with the various related problems of labor, finance, and taxation.
Your definition was a lot more extensive than mine. You must use Oxford. I use Webster's. Is there anything we need to discuss about this with economics? Because normally when people talk about economy, what do most people mean when they talk about economy? Money. Normally they personalize it. They don't I don't care what this is out over here. I want concerned about what I can do with do I have money? And if I don't have money, then these definitions oftentimes mean nothing to people, right? But it is a social science. The social science basically understanding how things work and function in society. So when you're dealing with social science and dealing with economy, you're not dealing with an individual family. You're dealing with the society. Now, can you have church economics? That's more confined, okay? So economics in general is the system that we're living under. And notice it's production, distribution, consumption, and how that works. Did anyone else define economics differently or have a different understanding of economics, thought on this at all? Okay, did anyone define any other words?
I didn't necessarily define words, but I was trying to think of what words I would search on.
Okay.
To kind of get at the topic.
Good.
So taxes, government, property, work, those kinds of topics. I
Sure.
thought related to.
And so you went to the Bible looking up those words?
Uh,
Is that what you did, or did you just find them first
I did.
or
I
second?
was just trying to get in my head, like,
Okay.
what are the subjects that I might look at?
That's good. And honestly, when you ask those words, normally we have verses that come right to head,
Mhm.
right? So like you can, and again, I would always want to encourage you when asking these questions. And oftentimes you're just going to all of a sudden run into somebody. You're going to run into a family member, and they're going to challenge the way that you think. And if you're going to challenge the way you think, your basic philosophy, you must stop and go back and make sure that you don't leave out any pieces to the puzzle. You don't want to assume anything. And sometimes when you go back and reread a verse or put it in context, you're going to go, oh my goodness, this is completely different than how I remember it. Okay. So make sure that when you want to deal with a question, you deal with it, especially with these words, you can't do too much. You can't, you're like, oh, I look at way too many verses on work. No, there's no such thing. Keep looking, because it all helps you develop your biblical worldview. And if it doesn't change, what it does, it hones it. It becomes more specific and more precise, and you become more confident in what you've already held to, or sometimes you change. Okay. Did anybody define socialism? Or let's start with capitalism. Anybody define capitalism?
I found a definition.
Okay.
The means of production are held by private individuals or organizations, not the government, and where products, prices, and the distribution of goods are determined mainly by and free market.
I think we both use Merriam-Webster's. Basically, that's it, right? It's private corporate ownership of capital goods, and all production, all distribution, all sales is private. There's when we first started as a country, okay, they had taxes based upon what? How did America make money? Anybody remember? No? Anybody know? Excise tax? Explain.
Excise tax,
Explain.
just taxes on, yeah, products,
Imports.
imports and export tax.
Tariffs. There was no income tax and there was no sales tax. Typically, paying taxes in a local economy, not federal economy, was typically done based upon an annual surcharge of your property. Because if you want a road, you want police, you got the community to come together and pay for it. And so they based upon how much property you have, and then you would go ahead and be excised a little bit. But most taxes were actually paid through tariffs. In fact, even now, there's only two agencies in the United States federal government that make money. One is the IRS, obviously. What's the second one? It's customs. It still makes money. Customs, who I worked for. So like when people come in and we're bringing cigarettes from Canada inside, and they had more than 2 cartons, I put a tax on them. And it was like it wasn't inexpensive. So if you brought, because they want to make sure that the cigarettes were just a taxed item. When somebody brought in a gold watch from Venezuela, there was a tax upon that. So where the country, and it's not taxed based upon where you bought it, it's taxed upon where it was produced. So sometimes there's free markets. So if it was made in Mexico, no tax, but if it was made in Venezuela, tax. Very unusual. But that's how America made its money for a long time. So this whole idea that goods and distribution are determined mainly by a competition free market, that was how America was started. There was no taxes. People made contributions. Sometimes there was a barter system. There was no receipts, the government didn't care who bought what, and there was no taxes based upon that. Now, if I buy a car, I pay sales tax. If I sell my car, that person pays sales tax on what I sold it to him for. And then if he sells it, then no sales tax is placed upon that. I go, that's just silly. But it's the same product sold 3 times, taxed 3 different ways. I don't know. I'm not complaining. Did anybody define socialism? Go ahead, go ahead.
The other one, a political and economic theory of social organization based on collective or recognized ownership or democratic management of the essential means for the production and distribution of goods. Also a political practice based on this theory.
So socialism is one of those words that's kind of like everyone in America goes, except for the Marxists in college now. It's starting to come up. Yeah, it's starting to come up higher and higher. The socialism is being pushed. And here we need to pause for just a moment, because if you don't know the history of socialism or why they believe socialism is good, you miss the question that really needs to be asked from the Bible. Because you go to the Bible and say, should the government own everything and distribute products based upon need, and the people just work for the government? You're not going to find answers to that question. So defining or understanding socialism better helps you define what questions to ask. So this is where digging deep. Did anybody do this? Anybody look into the root of socialism or what's going on there? Go ahead.
So yeah, there's even the definition, people disagree over whether like the government is like, I guess, required to be part of it. Some people are so-called like libertarian socialists, which sounds like an oxymoron, but they're like basically the people that like live in a commune together and share everything. But I guess what they all have in common is that they hate private property. Like
Okay.
That's what these things thing is.
1 second. What Brandon was saying is that all socialists hate private property. Why?
Well, I guess they feel it's free, but it's also, they feel free, but it's also like, I don't know.
Before socialism, before these countries, who owned property back before this new socialism, free enterprise system? Who owned property? Yeah, but who are the owners? Nobility. Serfs didn't own anything. They worked the land. They lived on the owner's property. They lived in huts provided by the owner. Before this, it was all oligarchs, right? It was all just royalty. It was all kings and queens. Russia, people owned a coat. Okay, that's what they owned. They rented from the landlords. They didn't know. Very few people owned homes. Okay, in fact, before America, what nation, go all the way back in the history of the world, what nation was ever free market? Owning property, individuals profiting off the land. One country, ancient Israel.
Yes.
Ancient Israel was a free market society. Now, when the kings came in, guess what they did? They taxed the snot out of them. But they did not assume the production. They did not, and God even warned them that if you get a king, guess what they're going to do? They're going to demand your sons and your daughters. They're going to demand your sheep and your cattle. They're going to demand your goods and your services. That's what kings are going to do. Why? Because that's what kings do. But the ancient Israel was supposed to be basically a completely free market society. The only thing that there was, now I'm going to say be careful, not a completely free market society. There were rules. Okay, but their only thing they had was one tax, and that was a 10%, 30%, and that was to supplement the Levites who had no land or property. But everyone else had property, inherited. We'll talk about that in a moment. So socialism believe that societal history is an ongoing class struggle. They said human history, this is from the very beginning, with oppressor and oppressed. That's the constant struggle. So socialists believe that this is the underlying issue, is this oppressor and oppressed. Okay, it's gone through 4 epochs: primitive and communal. Okay, so just primitive society. I see the stuff that you have and I want it, I go get it. I oppressed you. Okay, that was just free for all. Some people call that the Wild Wild West, right? Or they want land and you can take it over, you took it over. There was no real law out there. The law was the gun on your hip. That was it. Afterwards, it became more legalized. Then they were slave. There was basically, everyone was either owner or slave. That's all you had. Then you had the feudal. Then you had capitalist. So capitalist is simply just a part of the system of the oppressed and the oppressors. That is their thought. And every single one of these epochs, it all has one major issue. What is the one major issue? What's the biggest issue? You said it earlier. Well, but why? What's the issue though with private property? Greed. Socialists see greed as the number one sin. And socialism is a way to get rid of greed. If you get rid of greed, see, they believe that communism sets out, or socialism sets out, to free the human condition from the greed that entangles us and ultimately facilitates our own enslavement. We're slaves to capitalism. That's what they believe. Socialism is the most ambitious in its diagnosis of the human condition and its prescription for redeeming the human condition. They talk in these terms. The abolition of all private property and the dissolution of every societal force that basically exists because of capitalism. Because capitalism is rather a product of greed. Okay? Capitalists, by contrast, okay, that you could probably sum that up in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. They're endowed by the Creator. So for what? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty. Liberty basically means private property. Private ownership of private property is embedded in both the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, which is why they believe our Declaration of Independence and Constitution is evil. Because it promotes and even legalizes private property. And if I have property, then I'm oppressing somebody who might be on it. Somebody just can't walk through there. You can't come through here. Oh, they're oppressing me. That's not true freedom, they say. Okay. Locke was remarkable in specifying these rights. It says basically you had the right to possess personal property and property earned. That money is yours. Okay, that was Locke. He just he spelled it out for you.
John Locke.
Yes, John Locke. Yeah. Whereas American Constitution system recognizes the divine origin of humanity and human rights, communism does not. Communism, at its essence, is atheistic. Okay. So the American Constitution system does not attempt to address greed. That is an individual responsibility. It's also one of the reasons why many of the founding fathers said, if this country is not godly, it will cease to exist, because capitalism at its core permits greed. And when people get too greedy, society fails. That is probably one thing that we do not understand when it comes down to our free market society. Greed is an issue. And that's something that we often don't talk about within our understanding of how economics work. Although I did make this issue, I brought this point out to one of my friends who was trying to promote socialism. I go, you know what's worse than corporate greed? Because you're like, oh, corporate greed is so evil. I go, you know what's worse than corporate greed? He goes, what? I go, government greed. Because governments have the guns. I don't care how big a corporation is, a government can always take it over. Always. I don't care how big Google is. I don't care if they have their own freestanding army. Unless they become their own government, America can wipe them out. Why? Because America has all the F-16s. It has all the tanks. It has all the bombs. They can wipe out Google. And so when a government becomes greedy, that's when people die. How do I know that? Russia, China, Germany. I mean, on a wide scale. Can corporate greed create death? Absolutely. but not on the scale of government greed. So the core issue, okay, we have to ask these questions. Does God provide an economic principle? Does God speak to capitalism, socialism, or another system? And as I've already alluded to, what is the real question here? What's the real question? So what is the real question?
Got down to what is the role of government,
Okay,
because that kind of helps with putting parameters on whether or not they ought to be getting involved in ownership of production or distribution. of production. What's their role? So where's the Bible say about what the government role is?
and the government doesn't. Now the interesting thing about that, because obviously you can go to Romans 13, you can go to Genesis 9, you can go to the law, okay, which obviously we go to the law, we got to be careful because that was Israel's constitution. It does not speak to other nations. But the argument that some Christian socialists make, and it's a valid argument, is that the role of government in the Bible is not to its fullest extent. It's basically the generalistic concept. How do you promote justice? The government is supposed to promote, primarily, the government is supposed to promote justice. How do you do that? That is where it's silent. Now you can go ahead and say it tells you to punish the wicked. How do you punish the greedy? That's not very clear, right? So it's like if you go to the law of Israel, they have some actual punishments for the greedy. But this is where this is where the silence comes in, and where it's I would say for most people, frustratingly silent on this issue. I believe it answers the issue, but it's not exactly the one that everyone wants to hear. Okay. So that's a great question, the role of government. However, I find that it does not yet address the economic question, because you get to Romans 13, it says, custom to whom custom, pay taxes. If the government says you owe those taxes, pay the taxes. I mean, and what we have to realize is during the time of the Roman Empire, taxes were oppressive, and Paul says pay them without question. There's no like, well, I don't have representation. Who cares?
The other thing that he said, though, that I found interesting was in a society where the government, so in 1 Timothy 5:8, it's
Sure.
referencing where the government was providing welfare, he told Christians, no, don't take part in welfare. So you may put money into it, but you're not to take from the government and to support your family members. And so that kind of, for me, raised the question, okay, well, I've paid into Social Security. Does that mean I don't take from it because it's sort of welfare?
Well, in 1 Timothy, what's the issue in 1 Timothy? 1 Timothy in a
He's
situation.
writing to people living in a welfare state is what I.
Is that what?
from it.
Is
That's
that what?
what-
Is
that's
that?
what Chet reported.
Yeah, I would disagree. In 1 Timothy
Important
5:8.
here, even though the Roman government was a welfare state, the Christians did not make use of it.
Okay, in Ephesus. Okay, what was the economy of the first century believer? The widows in verse 9, okay, realize that if somebody's widowed or orphaned, what happens to the widow or the orphan in that economy? What? They starve and die. If they do not have a family member to take care of them, typically they die. They have to either slave themselves out, become street rats. You know, the Aladdin thing is not uncommon, that an orphan basically is fighting for scraps. Why? Because they're seen as a nuisance, and very rarely do people take care of them, because personal economy is either you are either the have in the royalty, or you are daily bread people. And for you to take out of your mouth or your kid's mouth and give it to some orphan was a big cost, a true sacrifice. Okay. So back then, Rome did not have, I have to disagree. Rome did not have a welfare system. The church had a welfare system that if they would take care of widows and orphans. And here it says, in this situation, if a widow comes in and says, hey, I want to be part of your welfare system here, and people would put money together and food together to pass out on a daily basis, but the widow has a son or somebody that, no, let them take care of them. And that was the issue.
And there were strict qualifications too, to even qualify to be on the widow's
Yeah.
list.
Exactly. And again, one of the questions is dealing with this particular text, how applicable is that to us today? It's hard to say. We may get there,
Yeah.
but really is not applicable. So using just read, because I taught First Timothy to my family, and I cannot find the Roman welfare state in First Timothy, to be honest. And so I
think he was just quoting maybe from what he knew about
Yeah.
that time period from history, not necessarily.
Yeah, and again, if somebody has different information, but especially in the First Timothy by itself,
Mhm.
the context seems to be if a widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family. That's their responsibility, and not just take from people who are being a benefactor. In fact, when we get to Ephesians chapter 4, it has similar language. Let him who steals steal no more, but be able to share. Well, is he stealing? Well, no, he's basically taking advantage of people. The stealing is not steal. It's like I'm taking stuff without permission. I'm taking advantage of people's charity. Don't do that. That's stealing. But rather work with your hands so that you can share. And so this issue of, because within the Christian community became very attractive to people who were in need. Why? Because the believing community was taking care of their own. When it says do good to all people, especially the household of the saints, a lot of that was in reference to the fact that they were feeding believers, because a lot of people did not have a lot of resources. And so wealthy believers were giving up of their resources to help feed the masses. And you had to have a good system in place. Otherwise, people take advantage of it, and actually you lead to more laziness and gluttony. So good question. Anybody else have like a more of a real question here other than economic, socialism, or capitalism? What is the real question? At the core, economics and politics, all of it. If you're getting people together and making rules, you're addressing a question. What question are you addressing? Why? Why do we need laws? Yeah. Every system out there is being implemented to address sin. If everyone was happy and functional and giving and charitable and nice and sharing, do you think there'd be any laws? I muted you, Shirley, so if you have a question, raise your hand. It's on the bottom of your computer. Your dog was cute, though. So this is the core issue, is that systems are in place to deal with the view of mankind. Socialism, capitalism is designed to, is basically started from a point of view. Capitalism believes man needs to be enticed to work. It does not address their core issue, but they want them to have a function in society. Guess what? You don't work, you don't eat. Socialism says if everyone just had the same thing, everybody would be good. So even though capitalism comes from the right angle, it still doesn't address all the ails. Okay, so socialism, capitalism, communism, a constitutional republic, a theocracy, a monarchy, all of it is designed to do one thing. And you mentioned that the role of government is to suppress evil. Why? Because man's evil.
Right.
And so no matter what system you have, it's all designed to do the same thing. And the question is not necessarily what system works, because I think we already know the answer. What system works? What's that? You said it? Well, yes. What system works? At the end, a system will work. A theocracy with Jesus Christ at its head. That will work. What economics will be in a kingdom?
Find out.
I don't know. Will it be free enterprise? Maybe, it might. But I guarantee you, greed will be addressed. And that means there will be regulation. Because it talks about that in the law system, in the kingdom system. If you're greedy, you're dead. How do I know that? Read Matthew. Matthew is all about the kingdom. If you get forgiven debt, you won't forgive another debt. Guess what? You're in trouble. The law is fierce in the kingdom, and it's designed to promote godliness, but God will make sure that that is accomplished, because human nature is still human nature. There will be humans in the kingdom, and those people in the kingdom, they have to be very careful. Now, I'm jumping way ahead, right? But this is the real issue. This is, even if you just go economics, not political, but economics only, this is still the question. What system of economics promotes the greatest benefit to the people? Now, we could argue this. How? How would you argue this? Can you argue it biblically? Say it loud. No. No, you can't. Whenever you get into a discussion about capitalism or socialism bringing the largest benefit to most people, how are you arguing? Oh, no, that's how you would start. But whenever, if I got into a question, say, oh, I'm a socialist, you're a capitalist, how would we argue? History, which is another way of saying what? It's pragmatic. Show me results. We have enough history to know whether or not socialism or capitalism works. Does capitalism work? Sort of. How many people suffer under capitalism? I mean, I don't know the number. Let's go with 10%. How many people suffer under socialism? 90%?
Yeah.
Okay. So, but what are we on? Say that, so the 10% don't matter? See, this is the issue. We, as Christians, we often default to capitalism. Why? Because it works better, not because it's biblical. Now, can you have a better system within yourself? Not capitalism, not socialism. Something, neither, but not one or the other within your own personal economics. See, this is where the question comes in, all right? So does God deal with does God mention economics?
To that
Go ahead.
question, what about, thou shalt not steal? Doesn't that in itself assume that you are able to have personal property? So that's a capitalist system versus a social.
Who are you stealing from? But does it mean personal?
It could be the government.
Yeah,
You
it could.
Steal from the government.
So in the answer, yes and no. Does the Bible speak to economics? Yes. The Old Testament law. You can go back to Leviticus, Deuteronomy. There are several places in the Old Testament law where he sets up economics. I'll sum it up because I don't want to read it all. Okay. There is yield fruit. Well, if you're yielding fruit, what are you doing? You're working the land. There is personal property in the law. And let's talk about the Mosaic law. This is Israel's constitution. There's tithes, taxes. Okay, but it's to provide for the Levites, not the federal government. When the federal government came in, above the tithes, you're supposed to give the Levites, David and Solomon and Saul and all the kings of Israel, all charge taxes to provide for basically a standing army and the palaces. There was no loans. The law forbade charging interest to Jews from Jews. They said, if you have a foreigner who you wanted to charge interest to, go ahead. But in the law, do not charge interest. There was no usury. There's a general possession of the land. So you had tribes who had land. And within those tribes, it was divvied up. You made markers, certain people and tribes. That land was never to be sold. And if you sold it, guess what happened in the year of Jubilee? You got it back. So there's a prevention of selling of private property. You couldn't just sell it. God says, no, I gave it to you. You can't give it away. Right? So is it free market? Yes. Do they own? Yes. Do they have rules against selling and buying? Yes. So it's not full free market, but there was a free market system. Did they have money? Yeah, they did. They talked about it. A denarii. They had during the Bible times, also during the times of basically they had precious metals they would trade, and they would do it by weight, a shekel. I can't remember what the other measurements are, but they'd have it, and it wasn't necessarily coinage, but they would trade silver and bronze and gold, precious metals, perfumes, various different spices were all seen as not necessarily just a commodity, but actually as money. I mean, people always like make fun of the gold, frankincense, and myrrh, like, oh, frankincense and myrrh, those guys went cheap. No, that was expensive stuff, and a lot of times not more expensive than the gold. So in this context, there was substantial freedom, but there were legal limitations on greed, on usury. It was illegal. You could actually, some of the punishments for severe usury was death. Buying and selling of people forbidden. Now, slavery, again, was bond slave. A lot of people would bond themselves to a person so that they can eat and live in a land. Sometimes they would actually bond their land out, and the people would use it because they're just not very good at it. So what's the issue of using the law for our own personal economics? Or we're not under law. Israel's constitution is not our constitution. Did God intend for these rules to be spread throughout all the nations? I can't find that anywhere. Now, does the church have economic regulations? See, now we're going to get into, and which I told you not to do, right? Because this is a trick question. Personal responsibility in economics. Dave Ramsey does a pretty good job. I'll be honest with you. He does a pretty good job of handling personal responsibility when it comes down to economics. I think sometimes he stretches a little bit too much as far as certain texts. I'm going, not exactly. Although it's still best practice, but a lot of his practices are not necessarily biblical or pragmatic best practices within a personal use, but he does at least try to consider God in personal economics. Obviously, he doesn't like any debt, and he uses some verses to say, don't owe anything to anybody. So that's not really debt in that particular, don't be obligated to anybody, where basically you had to subservient yourself to them. It doesn't mean don't borrow 20 bucks. Would I prefer never to borrow any money? Yes. It almost becomes necessary in our economic system, because who has $120,000 laying around? It becomes difficult. Should be our goal to get out of debt? 100%. But the Bible does talk about economic regulations. However, there is no structure regulating the legal aspects of economics. There are principles. Did anybody go to these verses? Now there's more. But anybody go to Hebrews 12, Hebrews 13, Philippians 2? Again, principles of economics. When we're going to the Bible to look for principles, especially when we can easily see a contrast between the law and the church, we really should try to find the principles found within the epistles. Now, don't be greedy. That is a transdispensational attitude, right? And greed is talked about in every concept. However, we should be free from the love of money. Hebrews 13. We should look out for the interests of one another. That's not just spiritual interests. Okay? That's Philippians 2. In James 2, we should not discriminate based upon financial standings. Don't look at a person's socioeconomic class as far as giving them the gospel. We've all done it. Well, like, I don't want to talk to that guy. He's a bum. Right? Or sometimes we have the reverse effect. Somebody comes in with a Rolex, nice shoes on, nice, zoot suit, and you're going, who does this guy think he is? That we should give freely and not under compulsion. That I shouldn't say, you must give. I shouldn't bind anybody to giving. That everything is given, that we have, everything that we have is for the purpose of doing good deeds. Whatever we're blessed with, whatever we have, whatever benefit we have, whatever society we're born into, if we have something, we're supposed to use it for good. That's basic principles, right? But when it comes down to economics, the church is not a national entity governed by legislation. Not a national entity. It's very important to understand, because a lot of times people try to run a church as a microcosm of Israel and Israel economics. How do I know that? What's the T word that everyone uses within church economics? Tithing. I go, really? 99
out of 100.
Yeah.
Probably.
At least 10% of them. Thank you. Get the tithe joke. But everyone tries to run the church as if we're Levites. No, we're not. We're not Israel, and we don't fall under a national legislation as far as economy goes. We're not supposed to go ahead and store up grain like Joseph. It's like this is not part of who we are. Now, can a church decide how much monetary, or like they did in Acts, like they did in Ephesus? Like, yeah, could a church be a commune? They wanted to. Dangerous. We were joking with somebody about that earlier. I go, don't worry, if they wanted to join the Beth Haven church commune and they didn't like me, I would just give them some Kool-Aid. Here you go. Yeah, right. Taste tester, please. But this is a huge understanding, because everyone thinks that the church economy is like Israel, and then American economy is free enterprise. Like, again, it's a lot of times backwards. What about these two verses? The love of money. Notice it doesn't say money is the root of all evils, all sorts of evils. But the love of money is a problem. And as a body of believers, we should all agree to that. And let me say something quite un-American, we should hold each other accountable for that. Greed is an issue from when? Who was the first person who acted greedily in the Bible? I would say that was greed or coveting. Cain. He wanted what Abel had. He wanted approval. He's like, I want what you have. I want. And so, and he basically, he took of his own and he wanted more. He's supposed to give God his best. He did not give it. Yes.
Wasn't it Satan?
Well, we're talking about our own creation, but good point.
Yes.
That is very true. Satan had, and he was not satisfied, so he was greedy. However, we're talking about our creation. So I'm going to rule this class. Thank you very much.
Good thinking.
It is a good point. All these verses deal with greed. All of them. What does Colossians 3:5 say about greed? This is an interesting question because have you ever heard that all sin is idolatry? You're just putting yourself as God. All that TV, too much TV, television, that's an idol. The Bible never says that. Interestingly enough, David was never accused of idolatry. That's all of his sins. Solomon was accused of idolatry. Why? Because he had idols. Saul was accused of idolatry. Why? He had idols. David was not. But here's something interesting, what they do equate to idolatry. Therefore, consider your members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passions, evil desires, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. Greed is tied to idolatry. Interesting. Why? It's more than that. It is more than that. Greed, the love of money, is basically the source of idolatry. Why do you have idols?
You're asking them to provide something.
Yeah.
Is that where it's going?
Mm-hmm. Greed is akin to idolatry, which threw me off for a long time. Why is greed akin to idolatry? I thought idolatry was idolatry. Why is greed? Greed is very one of those issues right there where being greedy. I tie this to the human condition when it comes down to anything, really. Husband and wife relationships are not supposed to be greedy. It's for the other person. And that becomes very damaging when someone is greedy and all they do is want rather than give. So, what is capitalism really? What is it?
System that allows you to take personal responsibility for providing for yourself and for owning things and giving what you feel is appropriate and freedom. It's economic freedom.
But what is it?
Rational self-interest.
Rational self-interest. It really does the economic system established by our forefathers in this country and other countries revolve around the thing that says, I will take care of me. You take care of you. And there is a problem with greed. But that is an individual responsibility. You cannot legislate it. That's the issue. Greed is a spiritual problem, not an economic one. It manifests itself in economics. But it doesn't have to be about money. Greed can be in relationships, power. Greed can be very about power play. I don't care about money. I just want power. So what's wrong with capitalism? In essence, it doesn't deal with the spiritual issue. It's a man-made solution to a spiritual problem. Is it better than socialism? Absolutely. Absolutely. But it is not the solution. The solution to our personal economic issues is taking personal responsibility for our economic issues. It's doesn't changing the system. Okay. We went from socialism to capitalism. Would that solve our ills? It make us more money. It would mean the most benefit to the most people, but it does not solve the issue. And unfortunately, a lot of American Christians, I am one of them, who's dealt with this a long time, fight the good fight of capitalism instead of fighting the good fight of faith. And we need to be very careful with that. So believing that capitalism is the right system is not biblical. It's pragmatic worldview. As Christians, we should not be arguing for capitalism as a biblical mandate. It's found in scripture, sure. So socialism doesn't make it right. It might mean the best freedom. It might mean freedom. And there's something tied to freedom, right? And when it comes down to biblical use and God wanting you to have liberty, but liberty without responsibility will be taken away. Changing the system or the party or the economics simply means we're still ignoring the problem. We can't have issue. We can support that which gives us. Here's how I vote. I vote for the system that gives me the most freedom, both economically, society-wise, preaching the word. But if I had to live in a socialist country that gives me what would I choose? A capitalist system that says I can't preach the gospel, or a socialist system that says I can preach the gospel? Where would I choose to live? I would live under socialism that says I can preach the gospel, 100%. And there are capitalists who hate Christianity. There are capitalists which will do everything they can to destroy the Bible and the gospel. So let's focus on our core issues. Deal with the actual issue. And we're putting band-aids on symptoms when we deal with our societal pains, right? But we got to be careful. And I'll be honest with you, here's I think the biggest point. Adjust our expectations. This world's going from bad to worse, right? And I do believe that we will become more socialist at the end. Okay? I believe the whole world will become more oligarchically, and everyone's going to be serving the state, and there'll be a few heads. It'll be that back to Russian type of rule, regardless of what we have. And be very careful what we call biblical. Calling capitalism biblical, I think, is actually dangerous, because we're setting a standard that we cannot prove. Instead, have the conversation. If somebody wants to get in a conversation about socialism, or I had the conversation. But at the end, what do I try to steer the conversation towards? Yeah, back to the gospel, back to the core issue, back to the problem, so that we can actually have a discussion as to what would actually solve our individual issues. And then if we have a big enough society where everyone's believers and everyone's kind and everyone is free from the love of money, we'll have a lot of economic freedom and prosperity. That's just the natural way of economics when it comes to that, because we're not taking from anybody, we're just sharing with everybody, which is very good. All right. So does anybody have any questions? Did you all have any questions about the ideas here? Anybody come to the same conclusions? This is a hard one. Toughie.
I ended up with just a lot of questions related to economics and supporting family members and that sort of thing in a system like what we're under today.
Sure.
Where the government takes so much from us, and then you're dependent on Social Security. So the first question was the question I threw out earlier. Do we then, as Christians, say, well, that's welfare and I don't need that, so I'm not going to take Social Security? And what about supporting family members? What if a family member has not been responsible, they squandered their retirement, they gambled it away, for instance, then is it still my job to support them in their time of need?
The question is, is it need? That's always a big question when it comes down to supporting people.
Mhm.
I had a brother-in-law who's passed, who found himself in need. And I'm like, really? Are you without clothing? Well, no. Are you without food? No. Are you without shelter? No. And you're not in need. Because
Yeah.
what is need? Oh, I need a car. No, you don't need a car. You can walk. Does having a car give you more freedom? Sure. But you're not going to have good personal economics. Don't ask me to support your bad habits. I've had several conversations with family members about that. And that's my guideline. Now my kids are something different, take care of my kids differently. But as far as my extended family, that's what I always tell them. I says, I will, if you're in need, clothing, food, shelter, I will help. If it's beyond that, yeah, you make your own decisions. In this country, there's no reason why a person your issues are pretty much self-inflicted most of the time.
What about the Social Security issue? If I don't have a real need for Social Security, but I've paid in for 30 plus years.
And if you had that in a private account, you'd have made a lot more money.
I know. Well, good thing away more than I gave the government.
I can't find the Bible where it would say that that would be not permitted. You pay into it, you're taking advantage of a system. As an American, you can go ahead, I'm going to refuse that because I think it's a wrong system. The Amish do that. The Amish pay their taxes. They don't take any welfare, and they don't participate in Social Security. They refuse to take it because they have their own convictions. The Bible doesn't say don't do it. For example, even Paul used the Roman system for his benefit. He got free travel to Rome to go appeal to Caesar. That would have been out of the pocket of the churches. And I'm going, hey, you know what? God got Paul to Rome and he made the devil pay for it. It's fantastic, But there's different things in which, as a society, whether or not we're going to choose to do that. I think it's a personal preference of conscience. And again, there's nothing prohibitive in Scripture about if you're paid into a system, taking advantage of it. Now, 2 questions: do you need it? And 2, that's pretty much it. Do you need it?
Or if you don't need it, maybe you just set that aside and that's what you give to help others.
Sure. And because again, when it comes down to like our own personal economics, is sometimes we make decisions that based upon not what we need. And I think we have freedom now. We have our own liberties about what we buy and what we have, and the house and cars and whatnot. We have personal freedoms. But the one thing that I've promised my family, that I would never purchase beyond my means, and I would never purchase that would go to sacrifice to them. That I wouldn't make a financial decision and go, oh, I wish I could help in your situation. Now, Sarah, I'll just throw in personal testimony. Sarah and I have put off putting a down payment on our 25th anniversary cruise because we're waiting to see what happens with Calyx. We want to make sure that if they need help, that we have the means to do so, and not go, man, I really wish we didn't commit to this vacation we want to take. That's what we have. So personal economics, Dave Ramsey has a lot of good ideas. I think it helps out a lot of people. And I think that having that economic freedom is very beneficial, to get away from the government interference and owing anybody anything. Because again, if you don't pay it, guess what happens eventually? Your freedom's taken away. You have that too much. So I always prefer, if we can get out of debt, get out of debt. All right. Any questions from the peanut gallery? I had a printout from my own personal notes. I can give that to you if you want. Yeah. No, for this class, I typically just put out my PowerPoints. So it wasn't like I had it before, but
Did people have it? You give it to people any other time?
not this, no.
Okay.
But I can give it to you.
just had his blank, he gave us a blank.
I have worksheet.
doc- Well, no, I mean. it's-
I have worksheet. It's a worksheet.
So I used what he sent online, and I filled in my notes on what he sent with the questions.
Any emails? I have it upstairs too. I think it's up in the back by what George Washington, there's printouts of the, you're on my email list. You know, that, you changed your email recently? Just text me your email. Okay, and your mom's too, so. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and pray. God in heaven, thank you for your word. Thank you for your truth. Thank you for allowing us to be able to ask questions and have principles found within scripture so that we will be able to function in our society with a good conscience. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Oh, next week's question. And but in 2 weeks, no class. So, and this is the 7th class, the 6th question that I'm proposing is my final question. So anything after this will be driven by you all. And if you have no questions, we have no class. Okay. So next week question is, one second. Should always write them down, right? Oh, environment. How do we handle our personal responsibility when it comes down to our environment? What is the biblical worldview about our animals, trees, rivers, lakes, our own personal environment when around our house, anything like that? So basically just kind of like get some ideas together about our own personal environment.
You want to go down the path of
Envir-
government interventions and
You could.
the global warming crisis